My name's Charlie Humphreys, and really I'm just here to welcome you and introduce today's event. Thank you so much to all of you for joining. COVID-19 and the challenges of gender equality, a very important topic, an issue that we've been focusing on quite a bit at Asia House. We're also very grateful to McKinsey and Company for working with us on this event, and we're going to be hearing about very interesting research that McKinsey has been doing on this. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our presenter and host and moderator for the discussion, Babita Sharma. Many of you will, of course, know Babita from the BBC, where she is part of the news team there, but also many of you may also know her for her authoring a very interesting recent book, The Corner Shop, which Babita, you are here at Asia House to talk about. Fantastic, and your documentary work. So we're absolutely delighted to have you with us. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to you and let you take it from there.
Marnie, thank you very much, and hello to all of you. It's great to see so many of you online today. Obviously, under different circumstances, we'd all be in a lovely room together, but here we are, and I'm grateful for you all joining us virtually. I am Babita Sharma, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's COVID-19 programme discussing the challenges to gender equality. Now, Asia House is really pleased to be producing today's event in partnership with the McKinsey Global Institute. And what we're going to do today is focus on the Institute's extensive research on gender equality, which is not only a pressing moral and social issue, I'm sure you will agree, but it's critical to the economic challenge that we face today. And we're going to take stock really in the next sort of 60 minutes or so of the regressive impact that COVID-19, the pandemic, has had on gender equality here in the UK and indeed around the world, and to discuss how to ensure that the role of women in the workplace and in society remains central to efforts in rebuilding economies in the post-COVID-19 era. And there will be a post-COVID-19 era, mark my words, fingers crossed, everybody. In a few moments, I'm going to invite Anu Madgavkar, the partner at McKinsey Global Institute based in Mumbai, and Deepa Mahajan, partner at McKinsey and Company based in San Francisco, to brief us on their research. And afterwards, I'm really pleased to say that we're going to be joined by two distinguished speakers in what promises to be a lively panel discussion. Barbara Rambusek, the Director for Gender and Economic Inclusion at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is with us, joins us from London. And David Isaac, who recently stepped down after 4 years as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the public body that promotes equality and protects human rights in England, Scotland and Wales. So welcome to both of them. But before we begin, I think it's really important for us at Asia House and myself to point out some of the findings that have really struck a chord with many of us this afternoon. And these are the findings from the McKinsey Global Institute that, like I said, extensive research, but just a couple to really get you thinking about what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. The first one being that women are bearing the brunt of the economic fallout of COVID-19. Now, the McKinsey Global Institute has found that women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to this crisis than men's jobs, while women make up 28% of global employment. They, in fact, account for 54% of overall job losses, a huge figure there. Secondly, that the pandemic is threatening to undermine the incremental progress in gender equality that was achieved in recent years. And now, even before the crisis struck, global progress in tackling gender gaps in both work and society had been marginal, to say the least. While in the Middle East and Africa, the region there experienced an increase in gender equality. Some regions have experienced declines in gender equality in work and or society. So we're going to be exploring that in more detail. And finally, a particular finding that I think will really strike a chord with many of you joining us today is that without intervention to address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women, we could lose $1 trillion in global GDP growth. And when we say figures like that, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because $1 trillion, we just have to take a moment and think about that, because conversely, taking immediate action could add $13 trillion to global GDP. So if we just sit on our backsides and do nothing, the cost is very apparent. I'm going to just take a step back right now to hand over to those that know more about this extensive research. And I should just say that before we get our panel discussion underway, which is coming up in a moment or so, we really want to make this session as interactive as possible. It's great to see so many of you here. So if you do have questions, please do let me know on the chat function, which is on the bottom of your screen. Message me and then I'll call on you to ask the panelists directly when the time comes. So I hope that makes sense. And without any further delay, please do welcome Anu and Deepa to talk us through more of their findings. Over to you both.
Thanks very much, Babita. And let me put up a couple of slides. We just thought we'd share our research with you using some of the material. But at the outset, let me just thank Asia House for this wonderful collaboration on a really important topic, and also our fellow panelists, of course. And then finally, just hoping that everyone in the audience is and your loved ones are well through this difficult time. So we are getting together to discuss, how COVID-19 has affected women, and I think the short conclusion, as Babita summed it up, is really that the effect has been regressive and disproportionate, and it set back an already set of slow moving indicators in terms of overall gender parity. So before diving into the effect of COVID-19, what I'd like to do is just reflect a little bit on the broader state of play, so to speak, on gender equality. And this actually dates back several years before this crisis, 2015, where we developed a framework to think about gender equality on these two dimensions, in work and then in society. Because the truth is that as you think about women in particular, it is very hard to separate both these dimensions. These are intrinsic parts of every woman's life, her role in work, her role in everything else that's around work or around the process of living and having a family and having responsibilities that are outside the paid work that you do. And when we looked at a range of indicators across maybe 130 countries that measured these aspects of equality in work and equality in society, each of these dots is one country. And what we found is that there's actually a very strong correlation between the two indicators. So as countries move along this continuum, it's very hard actually to make sustained improvements on gender parity in work without similar improvements in terms of a woman's role and her status in society. So this was an important finding. But then as we thought about the progress made since 2015 and then up until just before the pandemic, what we observed is that there hasn't actually been much progress, sadly. On both dimensions, at a global level, the indicators, these are sort of a 0 to 1 spectrum where the value of 1 represents, close to parity. But on both these dimensions, progress really hasn't been much, and gender equality in work is actually lower overall than gender equality in society. And this is because the world has made some progress, not just in the last 5 years, but over decades, on some aspects of social equality. Some of the very basic elements, for example, around parity in schooling, or parity around improved access to health and reproductive rights to women. So some areas like those have progressed quite fast in the developing world, but many aspects of gender parity in work have remained flat or even retreated slightly in some countries. We've seen indicators like the level of professional and technical jobs or leadership positions in business actually improve. But the core labor force participation rate, for example, or the sharing of unpaid care work between men and women are both indicators that haven't really moved much in the last 5 years. So with this state of, the ingoing state of gender parity already being somewhat sluggish at best with only small pockets of progress, we are seeing the effects of the pandemic unfold, and I'll hand over to Deepa to talk us through what those effects actually look like.
Great. So when the pandemic actually hit, we thought one of the things to really go look at is understand whether or not it's disproportionately hitting women or men's jobs in different ways. And we knew that there were a few factors to keep in mind. One is the most obvious, which is that different industries were being hit in different ways. So if we think about healthcare workers, many of them were protected in a lot of areas due to the sudden surge in need for those roles, whereas service workers were often in much more temporary jobs, and during lockdown, we were seeing unemployment spike. The second thing would be a whole bunch of other structural factors that are a little bit more difficult to put your finger on exactly, but you can see the effect over time. So when schools shut down, who's picking up the work of taking care of the children, both from a care perspective, but also an education perspective? What is the societal role in terms of deciding which jobs should be released or which individuals should be released? And are there any underlying biases that affect that? And so what we did is we said, let's actually look at the numbers and see what they tell us. So this is data basically in the summer, and we're seeing now actually in the fall that the results are still holding consistent in terms of trend, although obviously some industries are coming back a little bit faster than others, which is an ever-changing situation. So I'll explain what this chart shows you. So if you look at the world numbers on the left-hand side, this is saying that in the year 2019, roughly 40% of jobs were held by women and roughly 60% were held by men. When we look at the sort of jobs that were lost in that big wave that first hit over the summer, what we ended up seeing was that almost 55%, so 54 exactly, of jobs were held by women. So it's a lot higher than the actual share of women in the workforce. And of that 54%, you'll see that only a section of that is actually explained by the fact that those women were represented in industries and jobs that were more disproportionately hit by the crisis. So what that means is effectively, if men and women were actually laid off at the same rate, given the industries and jobs they were in, we should only have seen what you see in that middle bar, 43% of unemployed jobs lost being held by women. We looked at this across a set of countries in the world and found that actually that sort of trend of the actual jobs being lost exceeding those that you would predict simply by the job being held. So for example, in India, the number should have been 17% if you look just at job levels, was 23%. In Indonesia, it was 48% that you would have expected, but we saw 62%. And like I mentioned, these numbers are changing over time as you look at, which industries are bouncing back versus not. But what this did do is raise a really important problem statement, which is to say, what is causing jobs to be disproportionately lost by women over men? And as we think about recovery, and as we think about, frankly, this crisis continuing far longer than I'm sure many of us expected, what are the kinds of things we need to be doing to make sure this doesn't have long-term impact? On the next page, I'll just talk a little bit about industries. So as I mentioned earlier, there are many industries that were actually more greatly hit than others. So for example, at the top, accommodation and food services, so your hotels, your restaurants. Many of these industries that were actually hit even more by the COVID-19 crisis were also industries where women were represented in higher levels than men. So for example, retail, even manufacturing, are all industries where the women's representation was higher than it is in the overall workforce, which, as I mentioned earlier, was about 38%. There were a few industries that globally were expected to actually see an improvement in employment. And this was basically real estate, agriculture, healthcare, social work. And it just simply isn't enough to offset the declines that you're seeing at the top here. So I think the first lesson was simply by the types of jobs women are holding, they are going to be disproportionately impacted by this crisis because they disproportionately hold roles in industries and sectors that require close human contact and therefore have really regressed in this crisis. On the next page, We then looked at all those other factors that I just described to you, right? So what really is underpinning the fact that we're seeing more job loss? And we said, okay, let's first try to understand how many of these jobs are being lost due to structural impacts. And what we found was actually at an aggregate level, beyond just what you saw from an industry level, we were seeing about a 50% higher rate of job loss for women than was explained by those numbers alone. And in fact, if you were to add those two effects together, so the effect of being in industries that are disproportionately impacted, and then second, the effect of actually being disproportionately impacted relative to your male peers, you actually see that women are about 1.8 times more likely to be vulnerable to job loss than men during this crisis, which is almost 2 times. There's a few things that could underpin this, and we went and looked at this at a global level. You do see variation in the complete magnitude of this impact at a country by country level, but like I mentioned, the actual trend line stays quite consistent across the majority of countries. First, as this crisis has, I think, brought on not only economic uncertainty, but actually uncertainty within our own households. Frankly, unpaid care work, not just for children, but for many of us, our elderly parents or others in the household who need care are unable to get safe care. Even before the pandemic, women were 3 times more likely to be taking on unpaid care work in the house. And unfortunately, some of the surveys and data that have been coming out during this time of sort of quarantining at home have showed that while the overall unpaid care work burden has increased for both women and men, it is disproportionately increasing and being taken on by women. So, for example, some data points from India and the US, about 30% of women were 30% more likely to be spending time on family responsibilities. In India and in the US, women were reporting about 10 to 15 more hours of unpaid work at home, which is almost 2 full working days, depending on how long your days are. So quite a bit of extra work. I think second is the context matters quite a bit, and every country has very different sort of underlying biases or stereotypes around who should really bear the burden of economic opportunity and consequence. So, and this I found to be quite a sobering statistic, but across 80 countries, about 1/3 of respondents actually believe that men have more of a right to a job than a woman when jobs are scarce. And this is particularly true in South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, those regions kind of more holistically. And so within that context, as jobs are becoming more scarce, it's one of many potential explanatory factors as we look at that disproportionate hit we've seen in job loss. And then lastly, what does this actually look like across countries? And so we're seeing not just that there is job loss, so unemployment, but actually folks dropping out of the workforce. If you look across different countries here, so we've shown a smattering of countries, predominantly in Asia, given the audience, but also the US and Spain and Brazil. And what you're seeing here is that women are actually dropping out of the workforce at a greater rate than men. So of course that's happening with both genders, but it is more pronounced within women. This just underscores the difficulty we're going to have in both even just maintaining equality at the labor force participation rate levels Anu mentioned we've done in the last 5 years. In fact, we've now taken a step back. And this is a multi-year step back.
And this step back actually does have economic consequences, as Babita described earlier, which is to say that by our estimates, if we look at a scenario in which gender parity in the workforce is maintained at 2019 levels, had this further regression in the time of the pandemic not happened, and if you compare that with a simple extrapolation that says the women who dropped out of the workforce or were unemployed at this point in disproportionately high numbers, actually, that gap stays and doesn't get corrected, this is how you see, the mounting gap amounting to about $1 trillion of GDP lower in 2030 than if we had been able to maintain gender parity at 2019 levels. So that's significant in terms of global GDP, $1 trillion lower, but it's also very significant in terms of the 30 to 35 million women who would be, not in the workforce by that point in time. And that matters both to those women as well as, of course, to the well-being of folks who depend on them, and therefore impacts welfare in quite a significant way. Now, against this scenario, the alternative scenario is actually more the opportunity, which is, if you look at the right-hand side of this page, we have a scenario called Take Action Now. And what the Take Action Now scenario really says is, we looked at all countries in the world, and we did a simulation in which gender parity in work, namely the labor force participation rate, for example, improves steadily in each country, not based on some global benchmark or the best in the world rate, but simply based on an actual empirical rate of improvement that has been seen and observed in the neighborhood of that country. So for each region, there's a region-specific rate of improvement. And this scenario says, what if every country was able to emulate at least the best performing country in its own region in terms of narrowing the gap in parity at work? And that's a $13 trillion upside relative to the negative $1 trillion we just talked about. If we are able to take action quickly and sort of accelerate and get onto this better track, the best in region track, as fast as possible. And timing does matter, because our alternative is a wait to take action. What if the world did nothing and waited till about 2025 and then said, let's do what it takes to improve gender parity? You'd still have some benefit relative to negative $1 trillion, but not as high. So action matters, but timing matters as well, was the simple implication, I think, of these big numbers. I'm not going to spend time on the resolution, like what is needed. I think that is probably should be the bulk of our discussion. And I think we'll hear really interesting things from our fellow panelists as well. But in summation, we just wanted to highlight that from a policy standpoint, actions for governments probably need to consider and focus on at least these three elements. One is, how can we actually think about targeting women better and women-owned businesses better as part of continuing stimulus efforts? The second is to really think about the care economy, childcare, elder care, and the whole of the care economy as a crucial public good or crucial part of economic infrastructure, just given the disproportionate sharing that happens on these kinds of tasks. And finally, given that digital and financial inclusion is increasingly important for women's economic empowerment, how can we actually work decisively to narrow gender gaps in those areas? And similarly for companies, this is truly a leadership moment. Companies that step up on many of these aspects of gender parity, whether it's normalizing the whole business of remote or flex working, not making it a women-specific thing, but making it more normal to how we reimagine our workforces. Whether we think about doubling down on the key sort of weak links that are showing strain at the time of COVID, whether it's recruitment, onboarding new hires, or sponsorship to help women succeed. And then most importantly, a sort of top-down commitment, which we've seen in our research really does make a difference from an employer's perspective. So to sum up, I think it's a big economic opportunity. It's an even bigger opportunity to actually keep up to 230 million women empowered and in the workforce and productive and earning at that point in time. The repercussions of what we do or don't do now will be visible not just in the near future, but for many years to come. And let me stop there and look forward to exploring much of this in the panel.
Wow, Anu and Deepa, thank you very much. Oh, I'm feeling a little bit depressed. I don't know if anybody else is going to be. I can see people nodding away there. I mean, I know there is optimism there, and I know we're going to discuss the resolution. Just one quick, I mean, we've got so many questions coming through. I've got one just for you, Deepa, and something you mentioned of 80 of the countries that you spoke to, the majority of respondents said that men had the right to jobs rather than women. Was it mainly men that said that in that reply, or was that a mixed ratio of genders there?
These are just respondents holistically, right? So this is sort of the societal view on the right to
the gender makeup of that.
Should be a representative sample.
50-50. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, approximately.
Okay, yeah,
this is the world value survey. So this
one that I was really interested on. I've got so many questions here, but I'm just going to do, if I can, Anu, Deepa, just both of you just jump in here if you can, and just to be a very quick answer, because I want to bring Barbara and David in. But Jane is asking, are there any upsides to the crisis for women? For example, greater acceptance of new ways of working? Anu?
I would think that is actually one of the opportunities. I think for the section of the workforce that can work remotely, by the way, that's not the majority of the workforce, but it's still a sizable segment. The fact that it's a proven business model or a proven operating model that people can actually work on a remote basis, right? So to the cause of normalizing this whole thing of remote, I think that's progress.
Okay, Dom is asking, wonder if there are job type schedule even, behind women's jobs being more vulnerable to, for example, working part-time, job share, compressed hours, etc. Deepa?
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't explore that in depth. I think it presents both, there's a lot of correlations to the actual job industries that are most impacted, and those industries where often people have those kinds of shifts and those types of work structure. So for example, retail, accommodation, food services will often have part-time contract type labor structures, particularly here in the States. So there's a lot of correlation there. I think it poses both a risk and an opportunity, frankly, as we look ahead.
Okay, Eric wants to know, job losses by sex and industry, did you take into account the government sector? Yes or no would be great on this one. Anu?
Yes, we did. We looked at the whole economy, yes.
And Megan's asking, does this reflect jobs in the formal workforce?
This reflects all kinds of employment. The word job is a bit of a misnomer, but this is really work, because this comes from labor force surveys that look at all kinds of work, whether it's informal or formal.
Yeah, and I, as a new mum, will take issue with the fact that it could be 8 hours of unpaid work at home. I think it goes on for much, much longer than that. I'm really pleased that we've got Barbara and David with us. Barbara, I'm going to start with you first to begin this panel discussion. By the way, I should just say, keep those questions coming in. I'm going to do my very best to get you to put them to our panelists as well, because you don't want to see more of me, you want to see more of yourselves. Barbara, do these findings that we've just heard from Anu and Deepa there resonate with what the EBRD is seeing in the markets that you cover with the economic impact of COVID and disparity?
So thank you very much for having me today, and thank you very much for also this very, very interesting presentation just now. Absolutely, these findings very much resonate with what we are seeing across our region. And in fact, we have actually been drawing on these findings by the McKinsey report already quite substantially. Because we know that crises are not gender neutral, and we know that health crises in particular affect women disproportionately. But what we don't always know is how and also why, and therefore it's sometimes not quite clear what really needs to be done. And I think we're still in the middle of the crisis, and particularly also in the earlier phases of the crisis, in the earlier months this year, there wasn't actually a lot of data around, there wasn't a lot of analysis. So we were all in a way sailing in the dark, and the knee-jerk reaction was very much to just put money into the market and to revert in a way to very standard crisis response mechanisms. And so that is why it's particularly important now that we do get to have data, we do get to have analyses, we increase our understanding of what is actually happening, how women are affected across the different sectors as entrepreneurs, as employees, but also in daily life. And therefore are able to start shaping their responses and then in that sense build back better. So this presentation today and the discussion is therefore, I think, incredibly important. Maybe let me just tell you a little bit about the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. We invest in supporting countries of operation to become sustainable market economies. And that includes that they are well-governed, resilient, competitive, green, but also very importantly, that they are inclusive, so that they create economic opportunities for everybody. We invest primarily in the private sector. 75% of our investments are in the private sector, and we cover a region from Egypt to Estonia, Morocco to Mongolia, 38 countries across 3 continents. To date, we have invested about 10 billion euros in inclusive projects, and this year alone it was about 2 billion euros as part of our crisis response.
Barbara, can I just, sorry to interrupt you, what does inclusive projects actually mean? Because I hear that term a lot about inclusive and diverse, and I'm just wondering what that means in real terms, if you could explain.
So what that actually means is that these are investments where we invest in a client. That can be across a range of different sectors, from agribusiness to property and tourism to energy, you name it, basically. And we work with them to enhance ways in which they can create access to skills and employment, but also access to entrepreneurship and finance, or access to services that can be anything from infrastructure, road connections, municipal infrastructure, ICT connectivity, specifically creating new economic opportunities for women, for young people, for people in less developed regions, for people with a disability, or of course intersectional. You know, it's these characteristics are of course not mutually exclusive. So that's how we define an inclusive project, and we actually assess the impact that we seek to achieve with this project at the start, and then we track and measure whether that impact has been achieved. So that's how we define it.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And with that in mind, what's the biggest impact, the issue, I suppose, or the biggest challenge that you can identify that has been a hurdle in terms of dealing with this pandemic?
So as we have heard, I mean, women have been affected across a range of different areas. If we look at women as employees, we know that they tend to be employed in the sectors that are hardest hit. They tend to be in precarious employment. They tend to be the first ones to be let go, and to also have the lowest levels of social security coverage. And then, of course, we know women bear the brunt of the additional care work, the unpaid care work, both for children, but also for the elderly and sick, that comes as a result of this crisis. We also see women as entrepreneurs, again, facing a range of different challenges because of the sectors, again, where they tend to have their businesses, the type of businesses, the smaller size of businesses. And also women tend to be involuntary entrepreneurs. So very often women don't really choose entrepreneurship as a career option, but because there is simply nothing else that they can do. There are no available jobs or other ways of creating an income for them. So entrepreneurship is in a way the only resort they have. But that of course creates very different dynamics. Women are more likely to tolerate lower profit margins, but are also less or more risk averse and less ready to take risks because there is more at stake here. So all these things shape how they are impacted by the crisis and also how they respond to the crisis, and therefore the type of support that they need in order to be able to get through this.
Thank you. And I suppose the term entrepreneurship can take on different guises, but it's the perhaps the instability of that title that comes with it in terms of, you know, guaranteeing a financial income, that if many people find it difficult to equate that with, you know, a full-time job. David, I want to bring you in if I can, taking a closer look at what's happening here in the UK. And as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I think between 2016 and 2020, you'll be privy to the information regarding progress for gender equality in those years. So if you can, I'd be keen to find out what progress was made in that time, and then looking at this crisis, what you think is going to be the acute issue here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, I will take a UK-focused approach. And yes, I stood down from my role as chair of the EHRC at the end of August. So during that period of time, we managed to do two things. One, lobby and work with government to introduce gender pay gap reporting. And then up until the pandemic, when pay gap reporting was suspended, which I know wasn't popular with many people, we reported. And I have to say that the trends that Anu and Deepa have been talking about are very reflective of what we've seen in the UK, which is that in the 2 years of reporting, even based on the partial information from those who reported voluntary information, there was a slight improvement. So in relation to all full-time employers, the pay gap information for last year was that there was an improvement by 2% from 9 to just above 7%, but also that there are improvements that are better in relation to higher paid and professional jobs. So really reflecting the trends that were referred to earlier on. And of course, the most recent situation in relation to the stats is that we are fearful that those who are not advocates for pay gap reporting won't report voluntarily. And it's an excuse because, you know, clearly we know that COVID, for all the reasons that have been mentioned this afternoon, is going to result in, you know, a real increase in the pay gap reporting information and a real deterioration of progress. So for me, it's really important that employers, and again, Annie mentioned this, I think, you know, play their role. Leaders in businesses need to report voluntarily. They need to come up with really credible information in relation to what the direct impact of COVID has been. And then together, I think we need to work out credible action plans that are going to address not just the long-term issues, but the immediate challenges that COVID has presented. Because for me, you know, the business case is overwhelming. This is a moral case, but also government, employers, and individuals within workplaces who are leaders have a real role, indeed responsibility, to drive the kind of change that we're talking about.
Responsibility, voluntarily, there's a couple of words that strike me, because before this pandemic struck, I had an interesting time with my own organisation, I'll put it that way, when we were talking about equal pay. And I won't go into the details of that. But what I will
talk about that separately.
Yeah, by all means, I could do with some expert advice on that. But what I would say was the idea that companies across the board, across the world, are going to voluntarily even provide that information. It wasn't forthcoming before the pandemic. How do you go about ensuring that it will post-pandemic?
Well, I think what we see in the UK, but I think this probably is the case in many strong economies, is that there are outliers and businesses who see the business case, but also the opportunities of providing leadership in this area. And so those businesses are providing the information voluntarily. I'm a great believer in the carrot as well as the stick, but actually you're right. We need the stick to drive those businesses who either don't understand the importance of the business case, but also of the real need to identify and reward the best talent. And for me, it's a combination, therefore, of those who see the opportunities, but those who are perhaps reluctant initially to identify them. What we have seen, though, in the UK is that the gender pay gap reporting requirement drove a national debate, real scrutiny of firms' information, and the identification of real action plans to drive change in the short and the longer term. And maybe when we come to talk about solutions, we can think about the difference between long and short-term solutions. But I'm a great believer in and again, I think Deepa mentioned, you know, the importance of data. Data here is absolutely key. We need to encourage businesses to gather the data, to report and share on it, and use it as an effective tool to drive change.
Okay, and be honest about it. I mean, we all know there's a problem, right? We don't need to hide it. We just need to be forthcoming with the information. And there are a lot of questions here. And I am going to specifically ask all our panelists about the resolutions and the solutions and hopefully end on a note of optimism here. But I knew this would happen. Time is flying by. So I just want to ask, if I can, the questions directly to be put to our panel. So Eric, there was a really interesting one from you, Eric Swanson, about recommendations. I'm wondering if you'd like to pose your question to the panels directly. Panelists, please. Eric Swanson, do you want to unmute, or would you like me to ask it on your behalf?
No, thank you. It just took me a moment
wonderful.
to travel to the mute button. I made the observation that the recommendations, which I think are perfectly clear and strong, still seem to be aimed very much at, I'll use the term first world economies, and towards the kinds of large corporations that McKinsey addresses. And I wonder, how do we change those recommendations? How does the context affect how these kind of recommendations can be implemented when we're talking about low and lower middle income countries?
Great, Eric, thank you very much. Anu, Deepa, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I think that's actually a very thoughtful and incisive question, Eric. I live in India, right? We are not only a developing or middle income country, but also one which is substantially sort of below its natural position on that spectrum of gender equality in work that I talked about, right? We do have numbers that lag what you would imagine. So just from the standpoint of a country like India, or much of even developing Africa, for example, I do think that the two big policy, medium to long-term policy interventions which are critical that we talked about are very, very relevant to these countries. And this includes sort of professionalizing or creating a much more reliable and yet affordable care services economy. So the care economy in these countries is very, very fragmented, very, very unreliable. And I think there are dual benefits to creating both regulation as well as funding through public support, as well as some form of company or employer-based funding, some combination to actually professionalize this, because it not only creates decent and better paid jobs for lots of care workers, but also provides a reasonably good alternative for women who want to make use of those services and put their own labor to use in a more productive way. So I think the care economy is a big part for developing countries, and so is the whole piece around digital and financial inclusion, because as you rightly said, most of the labor market is either informal or it's very, very unorganized. Lots of micro and small entrepreneurs amongst women, and access to credit or access to digital platforms to sell what they make is a big barrier. It's a big challenge, and we need to again get that combination of public and private solution to unlock that.
Okay.
In addition, I would say, very short term, you can target greater payouts and benefits to women. India has done some of that, but these are the more important longer term measures.
Okay, thank you. And Eric, I hope that's answered your question. Vikas Agrawal, you have a question, and this is to put to everyone. And I'm actually interested in what Barbara's response might be to this, because you're, of course, dealing with a number of private large companies as well. So Vikas, over to you.
Hi there, thanks very much. Yeah, so a lot of the discussion that we have tends to be around sort of big companies, your FTSE listed companies and even medium-sized companies, but actually we know that SMEs make up the majority in terms of volume and often sometimes value of economies as well, certainly in hospitality and other sort of more people-facing sectors. How do you ensure that governments bring in policies that support SMEs to improve gender equality, gender positive practices without being overly burdensome on small businesses that may not necessarily be able to afford the cost of it?
Okay, I know that's probably related directly to the findings with Anu and Deepa, but Barbara, you probably have a view on that, so I'll head to you first and then maybe to David as well. Please do interject, both of you at the same time if you want to. Barbara.
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. So SMEs indeed make up the bulk of the economies in most developing countries, including across our region. What really needs to happen there is to create an enabling environment, and that has to happen at the supply and at the demand side. So if we look at women entrepreneurs themselves, they need much better advisory support, access to finance, and that needs to be tailored now and adapted during times of crisis. So, for example, what we do, we have digitalized our advisory support. We have set up knowledge academies. We are providing crisis mentoring support online, but also in relation to the supply side, it's about working with banks to, in a way, enable them to understand women as a viable market segment and to not look at lending to women as part of CSR or as a do-good issue. It's not, and it needs to be a viable market proposition, and therefore banks need to be supported to recognize that, to understand that market segment in terms of non-performing loan ratios, and just to understand the characteristics of this market segment, and then to tailor products and services directly at that market segment. And that's again what we do. And then the third area, in a way, is the regulatory environment, to work with regulators, with central banks, to look at financial inclusion strategies, to look at collecting sex disaggregated data to better understand where the regulatory barriers are, so that policy solutions can then be shaped based on real data and based on what's actually happening in the market.
David? Thank you, by the way, Barbara. Yeah, sorry, David, I'll bring you in now. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's a really important question, because when in the UK, the gender pay gap regulations were being drafted, we had to work out exactly what the threshold was going to be for reporting, and it's employers with more than 250 employees. I think now that number should come down. I think we do need to support SMEs and ensure that bureaucracy doesn't become completely paralyzing. But at the same time, if data is going to be provided for SMEs, I think it will help drive the sorts of changes and information and cultural change that we need even within SMEs. And, you know, I work in the technology sector, you know, when I'm not doing equalities and human rights work. And, you know, we know that even in small startups, you know, the dominance of men in those startups, you know, is something that we still need to address. And it's not a lack of female talent, it's a lack of opportunity. And if providing information in a non-onerous, non-overly bureaucratic way drives change, then I'm in favor of it.
Thank you very much. A comment here actually from Caroline to Anu saying, spot on, by the way, regarding India's care work framework, which needs addressing. Even the government's policy assumes women's unpaid, low-paid work as a foundation on which social sector programs are delivered. Very unfair to women. So Caroline, thank you very much for that statement. I just want to go to Megan, if I can. Megan O'Donnell, you had a question for the panelists. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I completely echo the conversation and the initial recommendation around needing to use this moment to catalyze investment in the care sector. I think what's tricky right now is we don't have a lot of publicly available information on what DFIs, MDBs, even governments themselves are currently doing to build out, both on the public and private side, investments in the sector. So Barbara, with you with us, you know, was curious specifically to hear a bit about EBRD's prioritization to date of that issue. Very cognizant of the fact that we're going to need sort of models of best practice or even good practice to be able to then switch gears and say, okay, this is something to emulate and to scale. Thank you.
Is there a question though, Megan? I think you wanted to ask in terms of the induced regressions as the one I was picking on in those best performing countries. I'll let you go ahead and say it.
So that was earlier. More interested in the care economy bit, but happy to ask about the regression as well.
Well, I found that quite interesting. So if it's okay, Megan, I'm going to put that to Deepa, because Megan initially asked, and this is at the start of the presentation, does the modelling that you described, Deepa, account for COVID-induced regressions in those best performing countries as well?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's across the board. So this is the downtick is across the board, and then the progress upwards, right, if we take action, is at the rate of where we've seen the highest level of progress in that region. And that was largely because we wanted to be realistic about, you know, based on what we've done historically, what could we really expect to see in the future? It's a good question.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time, and it really is flying by. Solutions. I'd really love to hear what our panelists think is the way forward. I mean, we almost need 10 more sessions like this to really talk about the whys and the roots of it. But if we can, Barbara, I'd like to start with you about, you know, what you believe the solutions are to everything that Anu and Deepa have described, and how we can really move forward in the post-COVID world.
So maybe very quickly, just on the care economy question. This is care economy investments are actually quite high priority now for EBRD, but also for many others, IFC including, and also the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank. We have a range of programs working with clients across many different sectors to support them in coming up with better care models that they can offer to all staff, not just the mothers. But then also to take that to a policy level, to bring the private sector voice into shaping care policies that are better fit for purpose, because we know that in many countries it simply doesn't work. So we do this in Turkey, we do this in parts of Central Asia, and I know that other MDBs are doing this elsewhere as well. In terms of the big solutions, I don't think there is a quick fix to this. I think this really does require painstaking work at every level. In terms of how we invest, how we support the economy, how we the policies we put in place to safeguard labor markets, livelihoods, and that goes from the furlough schemes, frankly, to supporting SMEs, to supporting large infrastructure investments, and including the care economy, the health sector. At EBRD, for example, we work very closely with health sector clients to prevent sexual harassment and violence in the sector, to just simply create a safe work environment for the majority of healthcare professionals who are women. So it really requires a very nuanced approach rather than a sort of one hit quick fix approach. And that goes for the public sector, the policymakers, that goes for the private sector in terms of their role as employers, but also service providers. And that goes for the tertiary sector, academia, you know, in terms of actually creating the data and the knowledge that then informs what we do.
Yeah, a coordinated response by all means from what you're saying.
Yes.
David, I'll come to you in a moment, but I just wanted to ask Deepa, firstly, you know, doom and gloom a little bit from the outset, but there's got to be some bright spots. For you, where does the hope lie in terms of the findings?
You know, I think it brings us back to what Anu almost kicked us off with, which is the opportunity to really rethink what work might look like for not just women, but also men, in a way that allows for us to build more collaborative work structures where we can more equally balance our care load, and frankly, have a more sustainable work-life balance. I think this crisis has really proven that we can do a lot more than we thought we could do. I went from traveling every week to sitting here in San Francisco at my desk. So to me, it's the art of the possible and how creative we can be with creating the kinds of jobs that are supportive for not just men and women, but also many other, you know, situations that we're all sitting at home with.
Yeah, and there's a couple of words that we haven't mentioned here, which is mental health. And I think that's very much tied in with what you're talking about here, which is the appreciation of how important our mental health is, as has been demonstrated in lockdown for all of us, and, you know, what flexible working means, really. David, to you, in terms of, you know, you painted an optimistic picture saying that there is an opportunity with every crisis, and I think you're right in saying that, but if you can just talk us through what that opportunity might look like moving forward.
Well, I think Deepa's mentioned it. We do need to take a step back and work out, you know, what the workplace might look like. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that, you know, just in terms of the use of technology, we've made more progress in terms of remote working and use of technology in the last 6 months than we've done in the last 6 years. So I think we need to normalize those practices. we all need to take responsibility for the sorts of changes that we hope to see. Men need to take more responsibility, not just for childcare, but for caring responsibilities. You know, some of those shifts are big cultural shifts, which certainly given my work at the EHRC, I know doesn't happen quickly. But I also think that we need to really work with government, with employers more generally, but also leaders across civil and public society to ensure that people know what good looks like, that it is affordable and that it's going to benefit everybody. But actually, a final point from me is just in relation to my point about using sticks as well as carrots, because I'm always shocked that, take for example the work we did in relation to pregnant women and new mums returning to work. Not only were they not coming back to work, or they are not coming back to work during the pandemic, they weren't previously, or they were being made redundant, or their jobs were disappearing, and actually feeling empowered to use the legal systems that exist, and things like positive action programs. It's a mix of responses, but actually I think that if we don't have the data, we don't use the tools that already exist, as well as the future-proofing stuff that we all need to think about, then we might be talking about this in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time. For me, there's a real opportunity now which we must seize and use old as well as new ways of thinking, and old and new tools to drive the change that I think on this call at least we would all hope to see.
David, for election presidency, just kidding. Yeah, we've been. Thank you. That were, incredible words there, and from Barbara and Deepa as well. Anu, to you, I mean, the solution game is probably a whole new different set of findings, isn't it, where you and Deepa and all your team are going to be working on. But, give me a bit of glimmer of hope, if you can, about what you believe is the right strategy moving forward.
I think the glimmer of hope is the fact that in the midst of the crisis, perhaps not on the gender front, but in many, many ways, governments have really been very bold in terms of their responses, in terms of scaling up the level of support and trying, new ways to reach out and support households and business owners. So this is an unprecedented problem, but also the scale of response has been unprecedented. So can we build on that spirit and say, going forward, particularly I point to the whole space of financial infrastructure and data and financial inclusion, and tie up something so that we can actually reach women who need the support, whether as householders who need support or whether as business owners. Let's get the data, let's track them, let's target them and support them. If it's possible to do everything we've done in the crisis now, it should be possible to do this going forward.
Yeah, and I have to throw my hat out there in the sense that I returned from maternity leave in the peak of the first wave of the pandemic this year. And I'm also facing job cuts at work, so threat of redundancy as well. And that's me with my profile on my platform having the conversation where I, as an individual, find it incredibly confusing. I, as a new mum, I in the workplace find it hard to juggle all of that. And I think that I possibly have access to a lot of information that many others haven't. So I can only really pray for those that don't have that resources available to them, and hope that there is a way forward and that they can get hold of the information as well. A lot of people are asking where they can get hold of the report. Anu, I think you've just mentioned that, but I'll let you and Deepa explain a bit more of how people can get hold of all your information.
So all of our reports are in the public domain. They're available online. They're available on our website. The simplest way is just to Google for McKinsey and gender or gender parity, and you'll see. I can also circulate and share a list for circulation with Asia House, but easiest just to Google. It's all in the public domain.
I have to say, I'm sorry if we didn't get through all of your questions. I'm sure that the McKinsey team, they'll love me for saying this because I haven't checked with them first, but they will be available on a Google search to answer any of those questions that you might have for them, because there are so many. And thank you so much for being so gracious in giving us your time this afternoon. And yes, you know, I think the conversation continues perhaps next week, next month, in the next hour, in the next year, because there'll still be so much to talk about as the landscape that we're navigating is ever changing, isn't it, at the moment? But I'd really like to just take this opportunity to thank all of our guests, to Barbara Rambusek, to David Isaac, and of course to Anu Madgavka and Deepa Mahajan. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Asia House was delighted to partner with McKinsey Global Institute to take a closer look at this important issue for you and to ensure that gender equality remains a global imperative issue despite the competing priorities in a complex world and indeed the challenges of recovering from the pandemic. Thank you all very much for joining us and for your engagement and your questions. Hopefully we will be able to see each other again at Asia House. But in the meantime, just like to thank you all for your time. I'm Babita Sharma. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at Babita TV. I'd love to hear from you all. But just remains for me to thank you all for being with us. Goodbye.